It began with silence, a silence so thick that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In the early hours of February 25, 1942, Los Angeles slept uneasily under the black veil of wartime fear. Just 2 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the memory of burning ships and falling bombs still haunted the West Coast. Somewhere beyond the calm surface of the Pacific, people imagined Japanese planes preparing for another strike. Every flicker of light on the horizon looked suspicious. Every sound from the night sky felt like an omen. At 2:15 a.m., radar operators at a small coastal station near Long Beach noticed something strange. A blip appeared on their screens, faint, slow-moving and unfamiliar. It wasn't a formation of planes. It didn't behave like one. Still, after Pearl Harbor, no one took chances. The alert was sent up the chain. An unidentified object was approaching the city. Within minutes, sirens screamed across Los Angeles, shattering the night. People rushed out of their beds, grabbing their children, shutting off lights, pulling blackout curtains tight. The city fell into darkness. From Santa Monica to Long Beach, the coast looked like a graveyard of shadows. Only the distant rumble of trucks and the sharp whistles of guards cut through the silence. Anti-aircraft crews took their positions, scanning the horizon. On the rooftops, spotlights came alive, slicing through the sky like white blades. Somewhere between the smoke and fear, the unknown was already moving. At 2:25 a.m., the object, or whatever it was reported 120 miles west of Los Angeles. It appeared to drift closer, slow and deliberate, as if observing the city. The radar trace flickered, vanished, then came back again. Soldiers waited for confirmation, fingers hovering above triggers. Command hesitated. They had no visual contact yet. But then came the first reports from civilians near Culver City and Santa Monica of something gliding above, large and dimly glowing, moving silently against the wind. The order was given, prepare to fire at 3:07 a.m. Searchlights converged over the coastline. Beams met in the sky, crossing each other until they locked onto a single pointer glowing mass that seemed to shimmer, almost metallic. The first anti-aircraft gun fired, and within seconds, dozens more joined in. The night exploded in thunder. Shells streaked upward, bursting into orange fireballs that illuminated rooftops and streets below. From downtown, it looked like the heavens themselves were at war. Witnesses later described a terrifying beauty in that chaos. Hundreds of beams stabbing into the sky, all fixed on a single mysterious object. People on their balconies saw the air vibrating with light. Some said they saw smaller shapes darting around the main glow-tinny lights, moving in formation, almost like escort craft. Others swore the large object absorbed the impact of shells without flinching. It simply hung there, unmoved, surrounded by bursts of smoke and shrapnel. Inside military command centers, confusion reigned. Radio operators shouted over static. Pilots on standby demanded clearance to take off. The radar kept showing movement, sometimes one target, sometimes several, but nothing clear enough to identify. The order was repeated. Hold the blackout, maintain fire. For the next hour, Los Angeles was under siege by its own guns. Down on the streets, chaos spread. Civilians hid in basements. Windows shattered under falling shell fragments. Some thought it was an invasion. Others thought it was the end of the world. The noise was deafening, echoing through the valleys and canyons. The sky was alive with smoke, drifting in thick layers that reflected the searchlights, turning the darkness a ghostly silver dot. By 4:15 a.m., the firing began to slow. The mysterious object was no longer visible. Some gunners claimed it drifted southward, then disappeared over the ocean. Others said it simply faded away. When the final guns went silent, more than 1,400 rounds had been fired. Not a single plane had been brought down. Not one bomb had fallen on the city. As dawn approached, Los Angeles awoke to a strange calm. Streets were littered with shell casings. Cars were abandoned at odd angles. People wandered out of shelters, blinking in disbelief. The only damage came from their own defenses' shattered roofs, broken glass, fires from stray shells. Several civilians had died, some from heart attacks during the chaos, others from falling debris. But the skies were empty. There was no sign of any enemy. Military investigators moved quickly. Reporters demanded answers. The press wanted photos, and soon, one image became iconic. A photograph taken by the Los Angeles Times, showing a cluster of searchlights focused on a brilliant object in the clouds. Smoke and tracers framed it like a halo. Some claimed it was proof of an extraterrestrial craft, others insisted it was nothing but overexposed light and imagination. Yet, to the people who had been there, the memory felt too real to dismiss. By afternoon, official statements began to pour out. The Navy announced that the whole incident was a false alarm, probably triggered by a weather balloon. The Army, however, wasn't so sure. They confirmed that unidentified aerial objects had been sighted, but refused to speculate on their nature. A few officers hinted at the possibility of enemy aircraft, perhaps Japanese, reconnaissance planes, or even psychological warfare. But no wreckage was found. No foreign planes were missing. Nothing could explain what had hovered over Los Angeles that night. Behind the scenes, intelligence officers quietly collected witness statements. Some of those reports would never be made public. A few described not one but several glowing discs moving in formation. Others claimed the large object had a faint hum, a mechanical pulse unlike any known aircraft engine. A few said they saw beams of light emanating from the craft itself, thin lines that moved against the searchlights, as if scanning the ground years later. Declassified memos hinted that some officials considered an interplanetary explanation, but such ideas were dismissed publicly to avoid panic. The country was already deep in war. The government couldn't afford new fears about visitors from beyond the stars. Still, whispers spread among soldiers who had fired that night. One gunner recalled watching his shells burst directly against a massive metallic surface only for the object to glide away untouched. Another swore he saw something break off and vanish into the sea, leaving a faint blue glow behind. But when divers searched the next day, nothing was found. Meanwhile, the photograph continued to stir curiosity. When enlarged, the central glow appeared disc-shaped, smooth, symmetrical, almost artificial. The US Army called it a trick of light. UFO researchers decades later would call it evidence. In the following days, radio hosts replayed the sounds of the raid, the distant thunder, the shrill whistles, the cries of citizens. Newspapers around the country ran headlines like "Mystery Air Raid over LA" and "Army Guns Blast at Ghost Planes." People debated endlessly, some laughing at the idea of aliens. Others convinced something had indeed flown overhead. In Washington, officials privately argued about what to say. The White House received multiple intelligence briefings. Even President Roosevelt's staff noted that the cause of the attack remained undetermined. But publicly, the government stayed firm. There had been no enemy, no visitors, no danger, just nerves and shadows. And yet, for thousands who watched the sky that night, that explanation never felt complete. Something had been there. Something that moved with purpose, that glowed against the darkness and absorbed every hit without falling. They could still hear the echo of the guns, still see the light trapped in the clouds. It wasn't a trick of the imagination. It was real. Whatever it was, as weeks passed, the story faded behind the daily news of war. But the photograph survived, and in that frozen image, beams of light still converge upon a shape no one could explain. Even now, decades later, when historians call it a panic, when skeptics call it hysteria, and believers call it the first modern UFO encounter, one fact remains: the night the skies over Los Angeles turned to fire, something unknown stood at the center of it all, and maybe it was watching us too. When morning came to Los Angeles, the smoke still hung over the city like a ghost that refused to leave. The sun broke through in streaks, glinting on the twisted fragments of metal scattered across rooftops. The smell of gunpowder drifted down every street. Reporters pushed past barricades, searching for clues, while soldiers carried away the spent casings that now littered the sidewalks. For the people who had stayed awake through the night, reality felt blurred. Had it really happened? Had the sky truly come alive with fire? Or was it all some mass hallucination born from fear? By mid-morning, officials scrambled to contain the story. Military trucks roamed the neighborhoods, collecting debris. Witnesses were questioned, their testimonies written down on official pads that would later vanish into classified files. News photographers were ordered to hand over their negatives, though one image already printed by the Los Angeles Times had escaped. That photograph, showing a glowing mass at the intersection of converging searchlights, was on every front page before noon. People stared at it in disbelief. The more they looked, the less it seemed like smoke. In living rooms across America, radios crackled with updates. An unidentified object was sighted over Los Angeles, the announcer said in a voice that tried to sound calm. No enemy planes have been confirmed. But what the listeners heard was something else. That word unidentified. It carried a weight far beyond war. For the first time, ordinary citizens began whispering about visitors from the sky. In Washington, the calls came fast. Army intelligence wanted every radar report from the West Coast. The Navy insisted it had nothing to do with them. The Air Force, still called the Army Air Corps, then claimed no planes were in the area. And somewhere between the silence of bureaucracy and the confusion of the night before, the truth began to fragment. Some officers privately argued that the radar blips had been caused by atmospheric distortion. Others, after reading field reports, weren't so sure. One note in a military logbook read simply, "Object tracked at low speed." Unaffected by fire, that single line would later become a spark for decades of speculation. In the days that followed, soldiers who had manned the anti-aircraft guns were told not to talk. But a few did, quietly, to journalists they trusted. One described seeing something massive the size of a city bus, glowing pale orange as it floated beyond the reach of their shells. Another swore he watched smaller orbs break away from it and vanish into the night. Their accounts didn't match the government's version, and maybe that's why they were buried beneath official denials by the end of that week. The Navy released its statement. There had been no enemy attack, only war nerves triggered by a false alarm. But that explanation never satisfied those who had seen the sky that night. The evidence, though thin, felt undeniable to them. No enemy aircraft wreckage, no damage from bombs, Yet thousands of witnesses all describing the same impossible light dot in the shadows of secrecy. Other investigations began quietly. The Office of Naval Intelligence requested copies of the radar data. The Army's Western Defense Command compiled a timeline of events, minute by minute. Within those reports lay contradictions. Radar confirmed targets moving at slow speeds one moment, then disappearing entirely the next. A pilot on standby claimed he was ordered not to scramble, something that suggested higher command knew the object wasn't hostile, or at least not human. But that, too, remained unspoken. Weeks passed, and wartime headlines shifted elsewhere. Yet, in Los Angeles, rumors lingered. Some residents said they saw military trucks driving toward the coast that morning, as if recovering something from the ocean. Fishermen later told stories of unusual debris metal, unlike any they'd seen hauled from the water near Redondo Beach, then quietly confiscated by men in unmarked uniforms. No one could prove it, but the whispers spread through the bars and shipyards until the story grew its own life. In 1947, when Kenneth Arnold reported seeing flying discs over Mount Rainier, the term UFO hadn't even been invented yet. But those who remembered that strange February night in Los Angeles were quick to connect the dots. If flying saucers were real, then perhaps the first sighting hadn't been in the skies of Washington, but right there over California. 5 years earlier, as the Cold War began, the US government created Project Sign, then Project Grudge, and later Project Blue Book to investigate unidentified aerial phenomena. Deep inside those files, researchers found references to the Los Angeles air raid of 1942. The language was careful, no mention of aliens, just unexplained aerial target. Yet behind the technical phrasing was a hint of unease. One memo described an unknown craft of considerable size that had been unresponsive to ordnance. Another noted that radar interference during the event was consistent with electromagnetic disruption. In plain words, something had jammed their systems. Still, the official stance remained firm. The Battle of Los Angeles was a mistake, an overreaction. But if it truly was just a balloon or a phantom echo, why did it take over an hour of sustained fire to realize it? Why did trained gunners swear they hit something solid? And why, decades later, would photos analyzed under modern techniques reveal symmetrical lines and reflective surfaces that didn't match smoke or cloud? The more the years passed, the more the event turned mythic. UFO researchers dissected every photograph, every eyewitness statement. They slowed down the surviving newsreel footage, pointing out shapes hidden in the light. Some said it was a massive, metallic disc nearly 100 feet wide. Others believed it was a formation of smaller craft operating as one. Whatever the truth, one fact never changed. Nobody ever identified what they were shooting at. For the survivors who had been there, the memory became a haunting echo. An old woman in Long Beach remembered clutching her baby as explosions shook her windows, watching a bright orb hover silently while the sky rained fire. A retired gunner, interviewed in the 1970s, described the event with trembling hands. "It wasn't Japanese," he said softly. "It wasn't anything from here. Our shells hit it again and again. It just kept shining." Decades later, documents released under the Freedom of Information Act added more puzzle pieces. Some contained references to experimental aircraft test projects, so secret that even many military officers weren't informed. Others hinted at recovered technology of unknown origin. Nothing conclusive, but enough to keep the legend alive. Each new scrap of evidence seemed to confirm what believers already suspected, that the government knew far more about that night than it ever admitted. And so the story grew, shifting from a wartime mystery to a cornerstone of UFO history. Television specials replayed the old photograph, zooming into its glowing core. Authors called it America's first official UFO cover-up. Skeptics countered with explanations: flocks of birds, weather balloons, optical illusions, but even they couldn't explain how fear alone could summon hundreds of witnesses to describe the same object in such detail. Today, if you walk the quiet streets of Culver City or Santa Monica, where the searchlights once crisscrossed the sky, the past still feels close. The old gun emplacements have rusted away, but locals say that on windless nights, you can almost hear the faint echo of artillery drifting from the hills. A memory etched into the air itself. Historians still call it hysteria, the product of a nation at war and on edge. Yet each re-examination of the evidence uncovers the same contradiction. So many guns fired, so many eyes watching, so many shells exploding, and not a single trace of an enemy. Fear may explain panic, but it doesn't explain precision. It doesn't explain the object that absorbed 1,400 rounds and vanished without a sound, somewhere in a forgotten archive. A few classified reels are said to exist, film captured by military cameras during the barrage. According to rumor, those frames show more than smoke, a luminous structure half hidden in clouds, turning slowly against the light. If such footage truly exists, it has never been shown publicly. Perhaps it never will. For believers, the Battle of Los Angeles remains one of the earliest proofs that we are not alone. For skeptics, it is a cautionary tale of mass fear. For historians, it is a moment when fact and myth merged so tightly that they can never be separated again. But for the people who stood beneath that sky in 1942, none of those labels mattered. They saw what they saw as night fell over Los Angeles once more. The memory of that night of thunder in the heavens and an unknown presence above refused to die. It lived on in whispered conversations, in government reports stamped top secret, in documentaries and late-night radio shows. The event became a mirror, reflecting our greatest hope and our deepest fear, that somewhere out there, something watches us, just as it did that night. Perhaps it was never meant to attack. Perhaps it only came to observe. Or perhaps it was something older, an intelligence that moves silently between wars, reminding humanity of its smallness beneath the stars. Whatever the truth may be, the question still drifts over the Pacific like a shadow that refuses to fade. What really happened in the skies over Los Angeles that February night? Was it the paranoia of a nation at war, or the first contact humanity ever witnessed but refused to believe? The answer, like the lights that once pierced the darkness, is lost somewhere above the ocean, waiting for those who dare to look up again.